Providence Row is a homeless shelter that was established and run by the Sisters of Charity, a Catholic organisation, a non-denominational society, which meant that any person of any religious persuasion was allowed to enter, but it was run by Catholic nuns. Ideally for Francis Thompson, who had studied as a priest, Providence Row would have been the best place for him to have stayed during his homeless years. By November 1888, which is when it opened during the winter months, Francis Thompson could have been admitted to the row. And we know that Francis Thompson stayed at Providence Row because he told that he stayed in Providence Row in the 1891 January edition of Merry England, where he wrote an article, Catholics in Darkest England. And in that article, he talked about the difficulties of living on the streets and the sadness of being a vagrant and how difficult it was. And he talked about how he waited with great eagerness to enter the row. And so literally from the stairway of Providence Row, on the night of the murder of Mary Kelly, Francis Thompson could have looked out the window down to the covered archway that would have led into Miller's Court. Out of the 100 or so suspects, I don't think you have a suspect that we can actually pinpoint to be so close to one of the murder sites. Even suspects who spent their lives living in the East End. We have ones that lived in neighbouring streets, such as Jacob Levy, but even he is further away from one of the murder locations. So Francis Thompson is the only suspect who we can show was closer to the murder than any other suspect. He also happened to have 6 years of highly skilled medical training in anatomy and dissection and a dissecting scalpel. And if you ask Francis Thompson, what are you doing at Providence Row? His answer would have been, quite honestly, I'm here seeking out a prostitute. I'm hunting down a prostitute who left me. Because that's what occurred. He'd had a relationship with a prostitute for a year. In June, when he first became published, she said she was going to leave him. He was devastated, and he refused to leave the streets, even though he was being paid by Wilfred Meanall, because he didn't want to lose her. He was literally on the streets of Spithersfield hunting down a prostitute who had left him at the very time that prostitutes had been murdered by someone that coroners and doctors and police officers suspected had medical and anatomical knowledge, which Thompson did have.
My name is Richard Patterson and I live in northern New South Wales and Ocean Shores, and I work for research for a company that researches alternative medicine. It surprised me that Francis Thompson wasn't a suspect. He had all the things going for him, and I was shocked that no one had conceived or bothered to write a book about him. So I thought someone had to write a book because he's such a good suspect. So I thought, well, I'll do it, and if someone else is better at doing it, then they can take over the role. I really thought that if I didn't write a book, someone else would think of it very soon after me and they'd write a book. And I thought, well, I'll just write a book and then give it to the experts and let them decide. I read a poem by Francis Thompson, and it was a short book. I was on the way home from the city to my house in Melbourne, and I thought to pass the time I'd read something, so I purchased a tiny book on a poet I'd never heard of. I was reading one of his poems, and halfway through reading the poem I thought to myself, I think he could be Jack the Ripper. And the poem, not that I'm great with memory, but it was called An Arab Love Song, and it was a very romantic poem, and most of his poetry that was published is really beautiful. But I remember one of the key verses says, "Leave thy father, leave thy mother, leave thy brother, leave the black tents of thy tribe apart. Am I not thy father, and thy brother, and thy mother? And thou, what needest thou with thy tribe's black tent, who has the red pavilion of thy heart?" And I thought, well, that's sweet. But he's actually saying love nobody but me. He's saying give up everybody, sacrifice everything. Don't have a sister or brother or family, just only love me. And he gives up nothing. And I thought, oh, there's no way anyone's going to be seduced by that sort of romantic poem. But I thought, but what if you're a prostitute and you're scared? What if you're worried that someone's going to kill you? What if you can't even get a room for the night and you're just in the cold and damp, and then there's this meant to be a butcher on the streets out to kill you, and then this Englishman comes up, or he taps you on the back and you turn around and he smiles and says something sweet to you like that. I thought maybe they might be seduced by it. And I thought, he's pretty sinister. And so I thought, well, I wonder what he was doing in 1888. Well, he had a major shift in his life from homelessness and drug addiction on the streets to becoming a well-known poet. I thought, well, he went through a major personal transition during the same year that the murders occurred. I thought, maybe there's a connection, and I began to research him. Well, it took me, I suppose, 20 years to write the book, and the research involved, in one way it was very easy and simple because much of the material had already been published. I sort of prided the theory in the fact that everything I was finding wasn't locked away, hidden under beds or in tin chests. It was in the local library. There were lots of books about Francis Thompson, and it just required reading those books with the eye that he's the Ripper. For some particular books, particularly the 1913 biography by Everett Meanall, that if you just slapped on the front of the cover The Secret Life of Jack the Ripper instead of The Life of Francis Thompson, and you read it from beginning to the end, it'd pretty much tell you everything you need to know about Jack the Ripper. But still, I went to Boston College, to the Burns Library, so I did travel to the United States and look at the archival material, look at his handwritten notes, look at his writing, look at the original letters, and I found information that I don't think anyone else had bothered to print or publish, and that's in my book. I did come to London, and I did go to the murder scenes, and I did visit Francis Thompson's grave, and I did have make forensic photography of the Dear Boss letters. So, and spoke to descendants of the victims and descendants of the police officers. So I did footwork and groundwork, but primarily a lot of my material was all there. And I sort of feel when I look at other researchers that they sort of trawl through the archives that I had an easy time because so much was published, there's so much already. Thompson loved to talk about himself and pretty much divulged everything, I feel. Well, not all the 20 years was researching. I pretty much had the material, the bulk of what could have been a book many, many years ago. And I wrote a synopsis for a book and I sent it to a publisher, and their reader came back to their publisher and said that my book is an oddity. The theory is an oddity and it can never make a book. There wouldn't be enough material, so I was rejected by a publisher. I then wrote some more, and I wrote my own self-published book called Paradox, and I received some sales for that, but I didn't really know to market all the way from Australia. The internet was in its infancy, and I knew the market was really the UK. And I sent that smaller version with a synopsis to another publisher, but the reader of that publisher said that I got my facts wrong because the Dictionary of National Biography says that Francis Thompson was placed in the Sorrington Monastery at the beginning of 1888, which was a typo from the Dictionary of National Biography. But that was enough for the reader to say, well, Richard hasn't checked his facts, because if he'd been in the monastery at the start of 1888, which is 80 kilometres away from the murders, that sort of lessens the chance that he could have committed the crimes, of course. So they looked at, so their readers looked at books, but not all the books, and they came to the conclusion that those books were right when those books weren't right. So I was rejected by another publisher. So with material which I felt could have gone to a publisher, I continued to build on the length of the book and bring up more complex discussions. One thing I noticed when I looked at Jack the Ripper books is that there wasn't, there never has been, apart from one book, which is the one I wrote in 2014, but a novelised version, there wasn't just a book that gave a chronology of the murders, a day-by-day account of the murders. Most books spend the first few chapters going through the murders, and then they spend the rest of their time going on about their suspect. And I've never seen a book that just says day 1, day 2, day 3, what's all the things that happened during each day. And I thought a day-by-day account. So I thought what I'd do is at first is construct a day-by-day account, a chronology of the crimes. And when I saw parallels that connected to Francis Thompson, I would create a new paragraph and say, hey, this is what occurred, but this is what was happening with Thompson at the time. So I thought that would be the best way to display the work. And so my first attempt was to talk about Francis Thompson up until 1888, then spend 5 chapters, each chapter on each murder, and when appropriate, bringing Thompson into it to show how he relates to those murders. And then after 1888, move back to Francis Thompson and continue with his life. But the non-fiction, which I'm going to publish instead, is thematic, where I talk about witnesses, and then I'll talk about the Dear Boss letters, and then I'll talk about the victims, or then I'll talk about the location, or I'll talk about the police. And I think that gives, I think for a reader, it's much easier for a reader to delve into it. But it was difficult to write. It was just a hard book to write because I actually, 5 women died. People were killed, and at the beginning, it wasn't a cerebral thing. It was very emotional. I felt that I'd come up with a suspect no one had seen, and because the suspect influenced world history in many aspects, it's things that I loved For example, I loved T.S. Eliot. I love his poetry, and I felt it was all stained in blood. I felt a lot of the things, I liked G.K. Chesterton, I liked Coventry Patmore's poetry. I liked so much of literature, and then suddenly I saw this dark vein through things that I liked. So it was difficult and uncomfortable for me. And also I was just sad that a whole bunch of women had been killed, and that Francis Thompson, if he was guilty, got away scot-free and had this life of leisure afterwards. And to me, it just seemed so unjust. Well, there's a lot more that I wrote that's not in the book. I've got, I think, about 120,000 words at the moment in the book, but I literally could have put 580,000. There are 3 pages taken away for every 1 page put into the book. I could have just continued to write and write and write. There was so much, because Francis Thompson was really well read. He knew heaps and heaps of history. And for me to understand Thompson, I had to read what he read. For me to understand the life he lived, and to understand the church, and understand the streetscape, to understand the religious history, to understand how he saw Spitalfield over many centuries, to understand how he might have perceived the women, to understand all the literature. He read Bulwer Lytton, he read Thomas de Quincey, he read Charles Dickens, he read Shakespeare. So I had to read all those things to understand the little minor references he made. I then had to read about other serial killers so I could compare those crimes. So I became well versed in all the other serial killers, well versed in literature, and the literature spanned centuries. So there was heaps and heaps and heaps of reading. Everything became important. I pretty much had to read everything just to get a grasp of the 19th century, to understand the world he lived in. The reason I left maybe 400,000 words out of my book was because I don't think a first-time author is going to get a publisher with a book that's many, many, many thousands of words. Pretty much a book that a first-time author can get away with publishing when it comes to a printed version is 80,000. And I pretty much pushed the envelope of 120,000, but I could have written much more. So my plan was, because I've got so less words that I wish I could have written, I'll just write only things that show that Francis Thompson was Jack the Ripper, and just stick to that. If I write a paragraph but it's not making the reader see how he could be the Ripper, I'll leave that paragraph out, even though it's fascinating, even though it gives you great insights into his life and the power and the struggle, and give a true indication of the human condition. I thought, no, I can't write this, even if it is great philosophy, I've got to leave it out. But when writing a book and writing a factual book, you know, I once heard a rumour that says history is just a distillation of rumour. And I soon discovered that what some people think are facts are really just opinion. We pretty much, you know, nothing is true in a sense. I've never been to the moon, so how do I know it's not made out of cheese? I've just heard someone. It's just faith. So many things that we assume are facts are faith. So when selecting facts for Francis Thompson and talking about his life and talking about the Ripper crimes, you might get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 versions of events. So I couldn't spend my time saying, well, this is what one person said happened, and this is what one paper said, and this is what the police said, because then again, I've got another 200,000 words. So I had to be very selective and make decisions. And I thought that what would stand the test of time is when I write what happened, I'd use the police files. I'd use the official record. So we'd say, so people could read it and think, well, okay, this is what Patterson's saying, but this is coming from what the people who actually cared, the people who actually wanted to catch this person, thought. Francis Joseph Thompson was born in Preston in 1859 in Winkley Street. He was born in the family home. His christening was a bit unusual because they spelt his name wrong. They spelled it without the P. They also spelled his mother's name wrong. And so there's doubt about the fact that he was even a Roman Catholic if there's issues with his christening. It was a Catholic community in Preston. Preston comes from the word priest town, so it has a strong and long religious history. Francis Thompson was fortunate in the sense that his Catholic community was a large community in Preston, so there wasn't much isolation. There was society. There were other people beyond the family and beyond the priests that he could associate with during his first few years. But it seems as if his first years were odd. He was always a secretive child, always a person who didn't really divulge things, kept things to himself, huddled away on the top of a staircase and kept to himself. He didn't really enjoy other people's company, even when he was very young. Then later on, at about the age of 5, the family moved, and they moved to Ashton-under-Lyne on the outskirts of Manchester, and things were very different there. There was a palpable fear felt by the Catholics at that time because the Catholic community was very small and most of the people surrounding them were Protestants, and Catholics were still seen as with suspicion and xenophobia since the Reformation. So Francis Thompson suddenly was more isolated. The family friends of the Francis Thompson family were Catholic priests. He only knew Catholic priests. There was no one else. So, and his father, Dr. Charles Thompson, was a Catholic lay healer as well as a homeopathic doctor. And when he entertained guests in the house, it was only Catholic priests. Roman Catholics, of course, have different levels, I guess, understanding of a Catholic life, but he had no other insight apart from the church. So it was pretty much ordained that he'd become a priest himself, and that's what he was brought up to believe. And then he studied for the priesthood, but already before he even studied, he'd had a few incidences in his life. When he was about 8 years old, I think, or 7, in 1868, anti-Catholic agitator by the name of William Murphy sent some people to the town. He'd already had fiery speeches of anti-Catholicism and had suggested that the Catholics killed babies during the rituals and pretty much built upon that fear. And a riot took place. There was a riot in his town and Francis Thompson's family were directly affected. People were killed and injured around him in the street that he lived in. There were 2 Catholic churches. One was gutted and burnt down. His family mounted a guard inside of the other small Catholic congregation with the priests, and they blocked the doors while rioters attacked with bottles and stones and tried to shoot into the church and tried to set it on fire. The rioting went for 3 days, and finally the militia was called in to quell the rioting, and that had a profound effect. People will say, there's the idea that serial killers have traumatic childhoods where they're beaten. Francis Thompson was in the middle of a rioting where he thought he was going to die, and they all thought they were going to die. I think about 120 houses were gutted and many were burnt down. The entire clergy had to leave town, so there was just no priesthood for quite a few months, just for fear of their lives. And that had a profound effect on Francis Thompson. He was already withdrawn, isolated and secretive, but the paranoia began to build from that stage. That led on to when he studied as a priesthood. He went to Usher College near Durham to study to become a priest. And even on the train ride, the boys bullied him and they crushed his jam tarts, and he reacted badly to that. When he first entered the school and got to know the other students, they whipped him and beat him up. But that was more of an initiation ceremony. And I've heard other tales from other students who've been there, the sons of writers, who have said that they just took it in their stride. This is how you got in. This is how you proved that you're a growing man. But he called them murky Aboriginal demons from hell. He said, how could they do that? The idea that I'd done nothing wrong and they just attacked me. This was something he never got over. He used to build little fortresses. He used to always hide in the library, and he'd make fortresses out of books, while the other boys would throw pellets of chewed up paper at him. And to escape that, he escaped into literature. He escaped into reading the histories of the church. The Usher College had, I believe, the largest Catholic library in all of England and had Catholic relics. It was a citadel of Catholicism, and Francis Thompson went to the heart of that to just bury himself away from what he thought were the tormentors. But also it transpired that he was a genius, even at that age. At the age of 14, he could speak and write and read classic Greek, Latin, French, German, I think several languages, even at the age of 14. And and out of the 21 competitive exams held in the school during his time there, he won 16 of them. And I think that was against 2,400 other students. But he was often too timid to read out his essays, which are mainly about battles and wars. He usually had another student read them out for him. So they pretty much decided that he could become anything in the church because he was just so intelligent, and he just had a massive reading speed even at that age, and knew several languages even at such a young age. But something was wrong with him. Finally it was decided that he couldn't become a priest. They put it down to idleness. They said there's something quite not right about him, and it wasn't until the final months of the several years of priest training that his parents were told that he can't be a priest, and then they sent him back home, and they were shocked. He had set fire to a few churches during his time, accidental or otherwise, and had caused a few problems, which may have led to the decision finally of the priest. But they just felt he didn't have the temperament to become a priest, or they even felt he didn't have a temperament to become anything, apart from the fact that he was incredibly intelligent and astute and articulate. But he was secretive and withdrawn. And then when he returned home, his mother suggested he study to be a doctor. And then he studied to be a doctor, but even at that stage, there was pretty not much hope of him, even if he did pass, of actually gaining a living for himself. He acted like a child most of the time. He would build fortresses in the house using furniture. He'd make fortresses with kitchen furniture and chairs and turn the whole house into a fortress and reenact battles and try to get his sisters to join in on him on those things. Even at the age of 17, he was role-playing and playing strategy games using the entire house and not really connecting with reality. But we know he studied. We know he studied as a surgeon because his name's on the register for every day at Owens Medical College. If he missed a day, his parents would have been informed, but there's no indication his father thought he wasn't studying. So he sat through the practical work. He actually entered with honours. To enter Owens College, you needed a high physical endurance, which somehow he managed to muster. And it was a particularly what we call cutting-edge institution that favoured practical work over theory. So they brought in heaps of cadavers, and there was a big push for the study of anatomy, and as a student surgeon cutting into bodies. And he went through that. He cut many bodies up. He had to, as part of his training, year after year. But when it came to doing the exams, he just would never take the exam. He never seemed to want to pass. Partly the explanation by other biographers is if he did pass, then he'd actually have to leave home and fend for himself, and didn't want to grow up. He wanted to always be like a Peter Pan figure. The other suggestion I've had from other biographies is that if he passed, he would have had to swear the Hippocratic Oath, which is that you can't hurt anyone, you can't do ill. And so there are two reasons perhaps not. But when the exams happened, and they usually happened in London, he'd come to London and go to the opera or visit the museum, then return home and say, I failed, and say nothing more. So his father would pay him for the college tuition, plus extra money, because he wanted extra money to cut extra cadavers up. And this continued until the third time he failed the examinations in 1883, and then his parents were distraught. Well, his father was, because his mother died the day after he turned 21, which devastated him. And now it was just his father caring for him. And also he then knew that his father had eyes for another woman that he planned to marry, which upset Francis Thompson very much, and he wrote some very bitter and horrible poetry where he considered himself to be tortured and mutilated by his stepmother to be. And so they tried to get him other work, and they suggested that he work as an encyclopedia salesman. So he got the encyclopedia to sell, and I researched which encyclopedia it is, and it does seem to be the Encyclopedia Britannica, even though there were quite a few editions. But he didn't sell a single volume in that month, but he read it all. And if you look at the reading speed of the encyclopedia that came out at that time, he had a reading speed of about 180 words a minute, which meant to be able to read all the volumes. So he was a rapid reader. He just absorbed everything like a sponge. But once more got more into literature and romantic writing, and became more convinced that beauty was medieval, that true chivalry and romanticism was something that was part of medieval life, and that the modern age to him was where beauty had expired. He said it all expired during the Reformation, when the Catholics collapsed. Then his parents urged him to become a soldier, and he became a soldier for a while. Well, he trained, he learned how to use a bayonet and use weaponry, but he eventually failed. I've heard an account that he failed because he refused to perform the drill and the marching. I've heard another account that he failed because his chest measurement was too small. But either way, he then got kicked out of that. And then there was a final attempt for him to work in a medical instrument factory, where I think he just worked on an assembly line, where just medical knives coming up towards him. I think he just had to pack boxes, but he only held that job for 3 weeks, and I'm not quite sure why that suddenly stopped. By now his father had pretty much prepared to remarry, and he had a huge argument with his father. Also, Francis Thompson by now had become a laudanum addict. He'd been ill while his mother was still alive, and she gave him laudanum to help him with his illness, but we're not quite sure what the illness was. It wasn't long lasting, but she gave him laudanum, and that began his addiction. She also gave him at the same time the works of Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater, and Francis Thompson loved that book, began to see Thomas de Quincey as a ghostly elder brother, and he began to desire to follow in de Quincey's footsteps. And de Quincey went to London and lived a life of vagrancy, but managed to reach success. De Quincey also had a relationship with a prostitute who left him, and Thompson decided to follow in his footsteps. And so, urged by de Quincey and his mother, who now passes away, Thompson finally had this massive argument with his father. First Francis Thompson argued with his father, saying, "Why are you marrying this woman? Why are you marrying this Anne Richardson? That, didn't you love our mother?" And the response from the father was, you must be drunk, or maybe you're on drugs, maybe you're stealing laudanum from my own supplies." And the fight became quite hysterical on both sides, and on November the 9th, 1885, he fled. He fled his home. He lived in Manchester for maybe a week or two, and then finally came to London. Some accounts say he walked to London, which was quite a long walk, because he hated trains. But eventually he reached London, and he tried to gain a living doing odd jobs: bookseller, matchbox seller, caring for horses near the theatres, shoe shine. But each of those things just fell down. He was getting a small allowance from his father, but finally he ceased to claim the allowance that went to the Charing Cross post office, and he just drifted into vagrancy. And at the same time, he got fascinated in the occult. He started to read the works of Bulwer Lytton and John Dee and the ancient magicians, well, not ancient, but the older magicians from the 17th century, and became fascinated. He literally devoured the works of the occults and continued to read about occult literature all the way back from, he says, into the ancient Egyptians and the Essene cults and the Zoroastrian cults. And he became more and more fascinated in other versions of what he thought were Christianity. He didn't feel like, in a sense, it was being pagan. He thought they were sort of echoes of Christianity to be, so he had no worries about doing that. He did have a stint of working for a shoemaker in Haymarket for about 4 months, and the shoemaker tried to mend the rift between Francis Thompson and his father, but it just widened apparently. And then he'd injured a customer I think it was at the end of 1886. He injured a customer's foot when he dropped a shutter on him, and then finally the shoemaker had to let him go. But while he was working for the shoemaker, that's where he wrote his, in 1886, his poem, The Nightmare of the Witch Babies.
A lusty knight, ha-ha, on a swart steed, ho-ho, rode upon the land where the silence feels alone, rode upon the land, rode upon the strand of a dead man's groan, where evil goes to and fro. A rotten mist, ha-ha, like a dead man's flesh, ho-ho, was abhorrent in the air. What is it he sees, ha-ha, there in the frightfulness, ho-ho? There he saw a maiden fairest fair. Sad were her dusk eyes, long was her hair. Sad were her dreaming eyes, misty her hair. And strange was her garments. Swiftly he followed, ha-ha, eagerly he followed, ho-ho. Lo, she corrupted, ho-ho. And its paunch was rent like a Braston drum, and the blubbered fat from its belly doth come. It was a stream ran bloodily under the wall. O stream, you cannot run too red under the wall. With a sickening ooze, hell made it so. 2 witch babies, ho, 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 ho.
In which he talks about, well, in the poem, you have a lusty knight that wanders through the streets of London, slaughtering unclean women and ripping their intestines out, and joyously yelling, laughing, ha ha, ho ho, ha ha, as he guts women. So he had already started to write quite morbid and dark poetry. And Then at that time, he had a few other incidences which I think have resonations with the Jack the Ripper crimes, but I might not go into right now. But primarily then what occurred was he met a prostitute when he would not have been, when there was the least likely chance of him having a relationship with anyone, because he was now looking pretty scruffy, threadbare, I think barefooted. Prostitute took pity on him apparently, and a love affair began, which lasted a year. It began in June of 1887 and ended in June of 1888. So he spent pretty much a full year with this prostitute who lived in Chelsea, and she encouraged him to submit his work and submit his writing and his poetry to various publishers, but they pretty much all said no. And finally he wrote to a publisher called Wilfred Meanell, who ran a Catholic magazine called the Merry England. And it was a progressive Catholic magazine that Francis Thompson admired, because although it was progressive and although it had many great writers write to it, it also expounded the idea that England should become merry again. It should become like the medieval England, the Catholic England before the Reformation, a time where there's chivalry and a time where there's high morality. And Francis Thompson sort of saw that magazine as him being as a pupil to that magazine. So when he wrote to them, it was important to him, I believe, that they publish his work. That was like his last-ditch effort. And he wrote on laudanum stained paper a letter saying pretty much, I'm like a villain in a Shakespeare character, so forgive all the marks and the shoddiness of what I'm sending you. I don't have many books, and I'm just doing a lot of this from memory, but here's some essays and here's some poetry. And he pretty much said, if you don't like it, just throw it in a rubbish bin, or I'll kill myself type thing. I don't care, my life's going to be worthless anyway. And the editor grabbed this bulky package with several submissions in it and thought, that's interesting, I should read that. And then he put it in a pigeonhole and forgot about it and left it there. Francis Thompson, in the meantime, thought that the editor had rejected his work, and he decided to kill himself. He went to a rubbish dump at the back of Covent Garden, and he took enough laudanum with him to kill himself twice over. And he says he took the first half, which should have killed him, when he was visited by his account by a ghost. And the ghost was another writer from the past called Thomas Chapman, who had committed suicide. And apparently the ghost warned him silently that you shouldn't kill yourself. You have a special destiny here on earth, and you'll be published if you don't kill yourself. So he didn't take the second half. And then Wilfred Meanell, 6 months later, remembered the package in his pigeonhole. And you have to understand, Wilfred Meanell was a very busy man. He was getting submissions all over the country. He had many famous writers contributing to his magazine. He knew half of London's literary elite and important political figures like Gladstone and Disraeli. So he was just incredibly busy, and his office was just a mess, papers everywhere. So he can be forgiven for forgetting about that particular package. But he did open it up, and in there amongst the submissions, he and his wife did see the poem about gutting women. But they just figured it was written by someone who was an addict, a drug addict, and pretty much the stained laudanum on the paper suggested that as well. But there was one poem he read which took his interest. He was about to throw it in the fire. He was actually just going to throw the submissions in the fire, because from what he read into the letter, he figured whoever had written this had killed themselves, or had just succumbed to starvation or exposure. So he pretty much thought the author was dead. And he was just going to toss it all in the flames and forget about it and just say, well, there you go. But then he did read a poem called The Passion of Mary, which was one of the submissions. And in that, Francis Thompson, in his poem, writes about crucifying the Virgin Mary instead of Jesus. And he thought, well, that's an interesting take. And it was quite a nice poem, even though it's about crucifying a woman. And he decided to publish it, sort of not really thinking that he'd have to pay anyone, and not really thinking anything would come of it. And he did publish it. But a friend of Francis Thompson's family, a person called Father Carroll, read it because he was a reader of the magazine. And when he found out that it was Francis Thompson, and I think he might have recognised the poem because it was based on a sermon by Richardson, another priest in Ashton-under-Lyne, then he contacted the magazine and said, look, this is Francis Thompson, I know him, he's homeless on the streets. And then Wilfred Meanell thought, well, maybe I'll try contact him somehow. Somehow Father Richardson managed to reach Francis Thompson, I think through the chemist that Francis Thompson obtained his laudanum from. and alerted Francis Thompson to the fact that his poem had been published. So Francis Thompson then wrote to Wilfred Meanall and said, hey, you know, you published my poem and you never got back to me. I know you didn't, there mustn't have been any ill intent, but here I am, I'm alive. And then Wilfred Meanall then said, wrote back to him saying, come to the office. And a few weeks later, Francis Thompson did. Apparently the door half opened and a barefoot person in threads, not even wearing a shirt, sort of peeked his head in and then pulled his head back out and disappeared for a moment, then slowly entered, and then he was shy and reticent. And the first thing that Wilfred Meanall said was, great writing, you must have had made a lot of research, you must have many books. And Francis Thompson said, no, I pretty much sold all my books. It was pretty much all from memory. And they began to have a friendship. So Wilfred Meanall began to learn some things about Francis Thompson. I think he may have known about the relationship with the prostitute, but I'm not quite sure. But he definitely began to know that he'd come from, that he studied as a doctor, that he lived homeless, and began to know a few facts about Francis Thompson. And he urged that Francis Thompson, tied himself up, and he bathed him, and he gave him some money for what he had published for Francis Thompson, and he fed him in the family home. And then Francis Thompson returned to his prostitute friend, and this is around June of 1888, and said to her, I'm published. Finally it's happened. And she said, that's wonderful, but now we can never see each other ever again. And he was shocked because he believed he loved her and she loved him. And when he inquired why she wanted to leave, she said, well, you're going to be a famous poet and I'm a prostitute. That's not going to look good. But possibly she might have wanted to leave him because she had the upper hand. She was the matronly, motherly, the dominant one in the relationship. And suddenly it was all going to change. Suddenly he was going to be the poet and the writer and know everybody, and she was going to be the prostitute, and that might have unevened the balance. Possibly she also knew about the poetry in which he writes about cutting prostitutes apart and ripping out their intestines, and she might have thought that might look bad on her. But anyway, she fled him, and he was shocked. It was a hugely profound traumatic influence on him that she could do that. And when Wilfred Meanall said, look, we can get you off the streets, you don't have to be homeless anymore because I can get a room for you, he said, no, I'm not going to leave the streets. I'm going to stay on the streets and seek her out. And that's the situation. So by the first murder of August 31, Francis Thompson was on the streets seeking out his prostitute friend that left him. And he was also living, I believe, in the Salvation Army in Limehouse. So she lived in the West End and she fled. And even though there's huge areas of prostitution in London, the bulk of prostitutes lived in the East End. And this is where Francis Thompson seemed to have headed to seek her out. I'd like to tell you about the 5 Jack the Ripper murders and how they connect to Francis Thompson with each murder. But to understand the very first murder, we need to know a little story about Francis Thompson regarding the Rothschilds. When Francis Thompson was homeless, he had this great fear that his dream of becoming a writer was going to just fall apart, and he really was going to die on the streets. He was panicky. He didn't want to be seen as a beggar. He wanted to have some vestiges of being a citizen, of being accepted in society, and not being amongst the outcasts and the lost. So what he did was he took a brief job at selling newspapers. So you have to imagine someone who wants to be in the newspapers now selling them. And he was on a street corner selling newspapers, just clinging to any sort of profession, so that he could at least say, at least I'm a newspaper seller, at least I'm that way connected into the publishing world. When a Rothschilds walked past him and picked up a newspaper from him and walked on, and he started to disappear around the corner. And then when Francis Thompson looked down at the coins in his hands, he realised he'd been overpaid. He was paid maybe 40 times more. Basically, the Rothschilds gave him a huge tip. And it was actually, from what I understand, looking at the Rothschilds' history, because I had to read their history as well, it was sort of a family tradition. It was sort of like good luck they were very charitable people, but they didn't like the thanks that would come after it. They didn't give money to hear the gratitude. So it became almost a game, apparently, the Rothschilds to tip and then sort of disappear. So the person they tipped or gave charity to wouldn't have been able to say thank you because they didn't want the thanks. So the Rothschild had become very adept at giving that charitable money and disappearing amongst the crowd. And Francis Thompson saw the money in his hand, and then it dawned on him that this person didn't think he was selling newspapers, but was a beggar. because maybe Francis Thompson actually found the newspapers already used and carefully folded them and tried to sell them and look legitimate. And Francis Thompson was so shocked that this stranger had decided that he was begging and wasn't working, that he tried to seek him out. And he pretty much left the newspapers where they were and raced through the crowds trying to seek out this particular Rothschild, and ran through the streets, but became hopelessly lost and actually then became delirious on the streets. And that was just before the murders. So I need to talk about the Rothschilds for a moment. The first murder occurred in Bucks Row on August the 31st. And if you look at where the murders occurred, they have these weird sort of echoes to Francis Thompson. Firstly, Bucks Row about 40 years earlier was known as Ducking Pond Lane or Ducking Pond Row, because there was a ducking pond. There was a small pond where during the medieval days and up to the 17th, 18th century, women, primarily suspected as witches, would be ducked in there and sort of, I guess, tortured or tested. And the first murder occurred pretty much on top. If you look at the old maps and compare them to the maps of 1888, pretty much occurred where the ducking pond was. Now remember, Francis Thompson had already decided those who threatened him, females who he considered to be evil, he would depict as witches. He described his stepmother as a witch. He described prostitutes as witches before the murders occurred. So it's interesting to see that the very first Jack the Ripper murder occurred where witches were tried. Second interesting thing about Bucks Row at the time was 100 metres to the south was the London Hospital. And Francis Thompson had studied as a doctor for many years, but constantly failed. If he had passed the exams, he did have the courage to stand up on his own 2 feet and look after himself. He might have been working at the London Hospital, which was a prestigious institution. The other interesting thing is that 100 metres or so to the north was the Brady Cemetery, which was the Jewish cemetery where the Rothschilds family was buried. Even though they were a wealthy family, obviously, like throughout Europe, it was tradition that if you're a Rothschild and you died, you were buried at the Rothschilds cemetery. So if you look at Francis Thompson's life, and he had to choose where he was going to kill someone, you couldn't choose a better place than Bucks Row, right upon a ducking pond with the Jewish cemetery, Rothschilds, which is a non-Catholic denomination, who had sent him delirious, the London Hospital that he'd never been able to get into because he hadn't actually, had the courage. And now you can imagine him, now I'm brave, I'm killing the witch, I'm doing it between the Jewish cemetery and the Rothschilds, I'm doing it with the London Hospital there. And that's interesting. And then when you look at the entire area of Spitalsfield and you just slow it down, people will say, Jack the Ripper killed in Spitalsfield, why? Well, Spitalsfield means hospital fields. And there was an area for 600 years, there was a Catholic sanctuary. At the centre of that Catholic sanctuary was St Mary's Matfelon. And Matfelon, which was later called Whitechapel, and it was called Whitechapel because it was whitewashed, but it was called Matfelon, which means black felon, from the name of, originally the name of St Mary's Matfelon, according to Edward Stowe, the historian, probably came from a crime that occurred several hundred years earlier, in which a jewel thief killed a woman, and he claimed sanctuary on the land because there was all Catholic sanctuary, that land. And basically the idea during the time of sanctuary was that if you killed someone and you went to a sanctuary, then you couldn't be arrested, because the Catholics back then, the medieval popes, had said that if you entered a sanctuary and you weren't struck by lightning, if you didn't die instantly, then you had to be innocent, because how could you go into church ground if you're a criminal and not be harmed by God? So the moment you entered the sanctuary, you could avoid arrest. But the entire area where the murders occurred was once a religious sanctuary, a Catholic sanctuary. So if Francis Thompson was killing this woman, and he is thinking, I'm killing a witch, I'm killing this evil lady, and I do it in a sanctuary, yet I'm not killed, I'm not arrested, to him it'd almost be as if God himself had given him permission to commit the crimes. You also see parallels on the dates of the crimes. One interesting feature of the dates of the crimes, so there were 5 murders, but they occurred on 4 separate dates. The police at the time and throughout the murders were looking for soldiers and butchers and doctors and even midwives, and they're looking for those occupations because soldiers and butchers and doctors and midwives, by the very profession, by the very trade, had to carry knives, and also had to cut into people or cut into things and get blood on their hands and understand bodily organs and get viscous fluid on them and make them be in pretty much unclean occupations. And so that's why the police were looking for these particular occupations. Also, coincidentally, and I think it's coincidentally to 320,000 to 1, because I got a mathematician to check it out for me, Out of 365 days of the year, back then in the old Catholic calendar, there were only 16 days of the Catholic calendar that had patron saints of those professions. And out of those 16 days of the year, 4 of those days happened during the Jack the Ripper murders. The patron saint of doctors and butchers and soldiers and midwives all occurred on the same dates of the murders. The very occupations the police were looking for. Now, who would know this? Well, Francis Thompson read voraciously. He had a massive speed reading. He read church history for years at a time. He spent his time in the Guildhall Library before the murders, where Stowe's accounts of the Ducking Pond were kept, where the ecclesiastical history, the church history of London was kept. He knew church history. He was an altar boy. It was his lifeblood. If anyone was going to know the Catholic saint patron days during the murders and know the religious history of Spitalsfield or Hospital Fields, it'd be our ex-doctor student. The second murder was Annie Chapman, and that occurred in 29 Hanbury Street. Annie Chapman, her name shared the name of Francis Thompson's stepmother, Anne. The murder occurred in the backyard of that address. At the front door of 29 Hanbury Street, written, I believe it was red letters on a white background, was the words or the name A. Richardson, because a lady called Anne Richardson owned the premises. So the name of the place and the name of the victim matched perfectly the name of Francis Thompson's stepmother, which was the cause of the argument for him leaving home in the first place. The third murder was that of Elizabeth Stride. Now, Elizabeth Stride was killed outside near the entrance of a socialist club, and socialists, by being socialists, are atheists. And Francis Thompson was a deeply religious person, and he wrote that he didn't like anyone who wasn't religious, who was ungodly, and it's interesting to see that murder occurred there. September 30th was the night of the double murders, and on that night you had Elizabeth Stride killed in Berners Street, and you had Catherine Eddowes killed in Mitre Square. And if the doubling of the murders, now Francis Thompson, his own name means, the word Thompson means twin. Thompson wrote a lot about twins. He had this idea of doubles, but he had an occult significance to it. He believed in the Vesica Pisces, and the Vesica Pisces is the old Christian symbol before the time that people used the cross. The Vesica Pisces he wrote about in his poetry. The Vesica Pisces he wrote essays about. The Vesica Pisces is on his tomb in the form of a crown of thorns and a crown of laurels. And the idea of it, to put it simply, is pain and beauty, or good and evil, of the sacred and the profane meeting. And that if you look at the murders, and lots of people made attempts at seeing a pattern of murder, and there's lots of accounts of people getting maps and trying to connect the dots to try to see a shape. But going from memory, if you look at the murders, and you look at the murder that happened of, and I can't mirror this, but you have the first murder was in Bucks Row. The second murder happened here, which was Hanbury Street. The third murder was on Burner Street. The fourth murder was Mitre Square. The fifth murder of Mary Kelly. So if you just assume like a boat pilot, and you say those directions, because they're not perfect directions, but you just make them equidistant and true. So you just use a compass and say northeast or north or southeast or west, then they actually make the figure 8, the Vesica Pisces. Now, if you're going to do something satanic with a cross, you invert the cross. And Francis Thompson actually talks about doing that in his murder story. He talks about pulling the cross off a wall and trampling on the cross. So there's the idea that a reversal or an inverse event or a ritual would be sort of a dark version. And so you can reverse a crucifix, but you can't reverse a Vesica Pisces. If you turn it around, because it's symmetrical, it's the same thing. So the next best thing you can do with Vesica Pisces is turn it on its side. And that's what you have with the pattern of the Jack the Ripper murders. And where the Vesica Pisces meet, what made the crisscross was the double murders. So I believe that to Francis Thompson, that was significant that he had to kill 2 on that night, which once again was happening in what to him he considered still to be sacred ground, which now prostitutes were now living in. on the patron saint days of butchers and soldiers and doctors. The final murder of Mary Kelly happened underneath the shadow of Christ Church, and Christ Church was the flagship for Protestantism. It still stands there today with its huge steeple and the bells it once rung, and she was killed within 100 metres of this huge symbol of Protestantism which celebrated the removal of the Catholics from England. And not only was she killed within 100 metres, Mary Kelly killed within 100 metres of Christ Church, which still stands today, within literally the shadow of it. 80 metres to the west, you have Providence Road Night Refuge, where Frances Thompson was staying during the very weeks that she was murdered. All indications indicate plausibly that he was there from, say, the beginning of November of 1888 to probably the 11th to the 15th of November, and she was killed on the 9th of November. And so he lived 80 metres away. And at the time he did have a dissecting scalpel, because he said he did, and he wrote that to his editor when he was moved out of the East End. And he, as we already know, his medical training, we already know that he had broken up with a prostitute, or more to put it correctly, she had fled him, and he had gone to Spitalfields to look for her. And then there's lots of parallels to Frances Thompson's life and the Dear Boss letter, of course. Providence Road was a Catholic refuge, even though any religion could use it. So it was non-denominational in theory, and they did welcome Protestants or any religion. They didn't seem to care. But it was run by the Sisters of Charity, a Catholic order. And Francis Thompson was a Roman Catholic who had studied as a priest for several years. His father was a Catholic layman. Wilfred Meanell ran a prestigious Catholic magazine, The New Cardinal Manning. It was Father Carroll who had alerted Wilfred Meanell of Francis Thompson's existence, has probably still been alive, and told Wilfred Meanell of Francis Thompson's history. So Francis Thompson, you'd think would be able to enter the refuge at any time, but he couldn't, because one of the prerequisites of getting into the refuge was you needed to have work. You needed to have reference from an employee to say that you were working. It was a very good refuge. Unlike most other refuges and doss houses or workhouses, it had a shower facility. The nuns were quite nice. You got your own bed. It was clean. You had your own space in the dormitory. And Francis Thompson could only get in there in the November of 1888. And what made it unusual was it had an open door policy. You could leave and enter at any hour, because people were considered to be working to get in, but the workers were usually artisans or tradesmen who had to leave, say 4 in the morning or 3 in the morning to light lamps or put lamps out, or work at the markets to get the carts ready, or be night watchmen. So Francis Thompson entered and used a refuge where you could leave at all hours with no questions asked, 80 metres away from Mary Kelly. It's interesting too that a writer called Hopkins mentioned that Mary Kelly used Providence Road, and a few other writers mentioned that Mary Kelly the legend's grown that Mary Kelly herself at one time used that institution. So it's not beyond possibility that they even lived at the same address at the same time. What's also interesting is that Hopkins, the writer, talks about Mary Kelly having a friend who was a poet. And then coincidentally, you've got Mary Kelly 80 metres down the road, down Dorset Street where Thompson's refuge faced, who's meant to have had a friendship with a poet, while our poet Francis Thompson's in Providence Refuge, who's meant to have had a relationship with a prostitute. So that's just another remarkable coincidence, or perhaps it's not. If Mary Kelly was the prostitute that Francis Thompson knew, why would he slaughter her? Well, it would be because he thought he'd live forever with her. He thought that they had the pure love. He thought that even though he would never have broken a religious vow, say sex before marriage, that he could give up his entire belief system to be with her, and she would do the same. So her belief system would have been, I sleep with many men, but now I'm just going to sleep with you. Hers would have been, I sleep with no one until we're married, but I'll do it with you, I'll sleep with you. And then she left him and shattered his world, shattered all concept and hope that he'd ever have any normal relationship with a woman, which he never did. So why would he kill her? Well, you could just say it's an attitude. Perhaps he was just a nice guy, perhaps he didn't care, perhaps he went to Providence Road just to maybe kill the other women, maybe to scare her back to his arms. I personally do not believe that Mary Kelly was the prostitute that he was with, and my book discusses who I think that was and what her ultimate fate was. But it's still very interesting that the legend grew that Mary Kelly knew a poet, and we have a poet who knew a prostitute. Francis Thompson is commonly seen as the greatest Catholic poet of the 20th century. His verses in many poetry anthologies. But I'd just like to explain that Francis Thompson, although born a Roman Catholic, I don't believe is within the Catholic tradition. If anything, he was an aberration and stood outside of it. In his own age, in his own time, people accused Francis Thompson of not being Catholic in his belief. He had ideas about heaven and hell, ideas about the occult, ideas about other religions, ideas about what it meant to be a Catholic that Catholics back then didn't really agree with. And although his poetry, such as Sound of Heaven, reached a height of sort of prominence in the 1940s and 50s, and really just around World War II, very soon after he fell out of disfavour. If you ask most people on the street, or even Catholics, who was Francis Thompson, most would say, I'd never heard of him. And that's because he was seen as too zealous, too hardline, too fanatical, and too a little bit warped in how he saw the religion. And he was kicked out of the priesthood. There are doubts about his baptism, whether it was actually correct. So I don't see Francis Thompson personally as a Catholic poet. I see him as a poet who had a very, very strong Catholic influence. But he definitely, I feel, is outside the circle of Catholicism myself. Francis Thompson's clothing during the time of the murders was unusual, but it actually helped him blend in. Francis Thompson essentially wore a long brown coat that covered his shoes. He wore coats like that, or even that same coat, all his life. He was described as a person who had a newness that was too dazzling to last. He quickly became dishevelled. So if he looked brand new and clean and had just got the latest outfit, within a few weeks it started to look shabby. And so he had a sort of a shabby genteel look. So he wore a dark coat, long coat, that was often marked and stained with little burn marks from him smoking his clay pipe, or wax stains, or laudanum stains, or just mud splatter. He didn't mind whether he stood out in the rain. He wore a hat which was described to resemble a fisherman's style hat, or a hat that came from the pictures of engravings by an artist called Osler, which was very much a sort of like a wide floppy hat that sort of came out this long, but it could be easily formed and moulded. So it could be tucked in to be a cap, or it could be brought up as a wide brim cap, but essentially a felt hat, a brown felt hat. From the start of the murders, he would have been clean shaven because he was looked after by the Meanwells. But when you see photos of him at the beginning of 1889, he's got pretty much a mid beard. So throughout the murders, he would have gone from clean shaven to moustache and beard, but not very long. And so he pretty much, he also had kept a gold chain or chain around him at all times, because he had a medal of St. Mary, which was given when he began the priesthood. And he never removed it, apparently. Even when he swam naked in the sea, he'd never take this chain off him. So he would have had a chain around his neck, but he would have concealed and kept it underneath the coat. That's what he would have primarily, and he had a vest, and he also had a necktie. He was known as the necktie poet. So you're looking at a man who's got a vest, long coat, sort of wide-brimmed felt hat that's brown, but that wasn't the normal dress. Okay, he would have looked unusual, but in the East End he wouldn't have, because he would have looked Jewish essentially. If you look at the Hasidic Jews, the Jews of that type, they wore wide-brimmed black hats and they wore long coats. So he would have looked to someone who's Jewish-ish, but not Jewish. But he would have looked to most of the Gentiles as someone who's foreign, or perhaps Jewish. But he wouldn't have stood out because of the dark colours and the shabby clothing. And also he would have been quite skilled living on the streets for 3 years to evade looking suspicious, because if he looked suspicious, he would have had to move on and not be able to sleep. Francis Thompson's voice has been described as being having a musical quality to it, and a voice of a man of culture, but a heavily accented Lancashire accent as well. But I understand from reading other accounts of his voice that he could simply just change his voice as he changed his writing depending on who he addressed. But if you heard his voice and you were in the East End and someone said, describe his voice, you would say it was a voice foreign to the East End. What evidence and research I have that I feel links Francis Thompson to the Ripper murders is what we would just call, at first glance, would just be circumstantial evidence. We've just got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of circumstantial evidence. Perhaps he's not Jack the Ripper, perhaps it's just, as his biographer said in 1965, John Evangelist Walsh, he called it the most remarkable coincidence in Francis Thompson's life. Perhaps it's just the most remarkable coincidence in his life that he happened to be in the very streets seeking out a prostitute during the time that someone was killing prostitutes. And perhaps, even though I've got literally like thousands of little pieces of information that draw this picture that Francis Thompson did, it's all circumstantial evidence. But saying that, there is some interesting, what I suppose people would call factual evidence or hard evidence, and there was a letter written by Jack the Ripper, and this was found this year by a lady called Elsie Lively, and she, by serendipity, researching another suspect, found a Jack the Ripper letter that has written on the top of it the initials FT within the date. So we've got a Jack the Ripper with Francis Thompson's initials on it, even if it's not Francis Thompson. That's interesting. Other evidence could be the hair of the puppet theatre. He had a puppet theatre, a cardboard puppet theatre that he kept all his life. He went to, when his father died, he went to Manchester and retrieved it, and was found amongst his belongings after his death. And that puppet theatre, he replaced the string with human hair, primarily of the Wolfram Meanall daughters. But when I read about and he labelled each doll, like Sylvia's hair shall work the figures and things like that. And I also read that some of the dolls had the names, there was a Mary and there was an Anne, and you could argue that the Mary and the Anne could be his sister Mary or his sister Anne. But it's interesting that the Ripper victims were called Mary and Anne. And if we ever stumbled upon that puppet theatre, it might be interesting to see if the human hair, which he replaced strangely from the string, happens to match maybe one or more victims. We also have a hand cast by Francis Thompson, a life cast of his hand, made out of plaster, and it's apparently quite detailed. And there was a Dear Boss letter, or one of the Jack the Ripper letters, I think the Dear Boss letter, that had an imprint of a thumb, with a thumbprint, with red ink. And it'd be interesting to see whether his thumb on his hand cast matched that Jack the Ripper letter. But if that did happen, it'd just prove he wrote letters to the police. It wouldn't prove he was Jack the Ripper, of course. Francis Thompson we know he had a dissecting scalpel. My research into medical students back in that day said they didn't just possess a dissecting scalpel. If you had a dissecting scalpel, you actually had a medical toolkit. He would have most likely, because medical students did, especially since he was there for several years, have his own medical kit, his own knife kit, which would be maybe in a folding pouch. And we know that of that medical kit that he boasted of having the dissecting scalpel, and that he was carrying it at the time of the murders. And people normally wouldn't use a dissecting scalpel to shave with, but that's what he said he did when he boasted in the letter to his editor in February of 1889. And it was something he had to carry on him at all times because he was homeless. He couldn't put it in a drawer somewhere and just hope it was going to be okay, or leave it at home. So he literally, if you met Francis Thompson any time of the day, 24/7, he would have had his dissecting scalpel. From speaking with a pathologist, Dr. Joseph Rupp, who first came up with a theory and connected Francis Thompson and Jack the Ripper in his 1988 article, and he's performed 9,000 autopsies, and he's been expert witness for American cases, high-profile cases. He says that the Ripper would most likely have had a dissecting scalpel or short knife, because people have this image of a long-bladed instrument looking at the depths of the wounding, but to do precision work, to remove organs in the dark in a very short time frame, just by feel alone, to do that and not even cut your own hands is difficult. To carry such a sharp razor blade knife in your pockets without cutting through would be difficult. But with a shorter knife, you can just put a cork over it to make it harmless. With a dissecting scalpel, you could do the fine work. Catherine Enos in Mitre Square, she had little triangles cut under her eyes, which harken back to the triangular vesica Pisces. She had little slits put into her eyelids, and fine sort of precision work. Even though she was mutilated really badly, her death was, in the coroner's report, says was instantaneous by a small nick to the left carotid artery, which is very difficult to do with a large knife. So the precision work that is seen in Jack the Ripper most likely was done, I believe, with a dissecting scalpel, and I've had other people agree with me who have got medical skill and training. That doesn't mean that Francis Thompson didn't have a whole medical kit, since he did work as a study as a student, since he did work in a medical instrument factory just before leaving Manchester. A Victorian dissecting knife was different to a modern one. For one thing, they weren't as short. A modern dissecting scalpel may be, say, 1 inch long, but Victorian ones were 2 inches to 2.5 inches in length. So they were just longer too, if that is of any interest. Firstly, what I look for in a Jack the Ripper book is I look for plausibility. I try to look for a book that doesn't make too many leaps of logic. I try to have a book that doesn't use emotive language. I like a book that persuades me using logic. I know a lot of suspect books will go through the crimes and sort of rile up the reader and make the reader so aghast and so horrified at what's happened that the moment you mention the name, you just literally want to, blame it on someone. So I've seen many writers that will go into such gory detail and make you feel so sorry for the victims that the moment they mention their suspect, you just want to point the finger, looking for the scapegoat. And I don't like that sort of style of suspect book, and I've tried not to do that with Francis Thompson. I also know a lot of books like to almost sensationalise it by showing really graphic images to once again push a theory or suggest things, but I don't like to do that either. So I look for a book that that shows logical sequences, that says A, premise A and premise B, therefore conclusion C. And I don't like books, the suspect books that say, so he must have done it, and he's unique, and sort of wild sort of conclusions. I like books that say maybe, possibly, and as well. What am I trying to say with my book? I'm trying to say Francis Thompson is someone we should look at. I think it's someone we should look at not only because he's an interesting suspect, but because he influenced world history. And people, even today, millions of people around the world are forced to study Francis Thompson's poetry. He's on the curriculum of schools all the way from here to India. And there are students, there are young people growing up who are forming their opinions, who are forming psychologies and personalities, being told, read these words, read the words of this man because he was a good man, he was a holy man. When Francis Thompson himself said that words have power and change people's beliefs. Words are magical, or were magical to Francis Thompson. And there are people out there today reading his words, thinking he's just a nice guy and we should follow his doctrines and we should follow his morality. And I'm saying in my book, let's look at Francis Thompson, because if Francis Thompson was Jack the Ripper, then Gandhi's favourite book was written by Jack the Ripper. It means J.R. Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, the Elven cities come from words made by Jack the Ripper. It means when the US Supreme Court made the 1955 Brown versus the Board of Education decision, the most important decision in US Supreme Court history, they quoted the words of Jack the Ripper. I think we should really think, not just because it's an interesting case that happened 120 years ago, but because he profoundly influenced modern history, and we'd live in his history. And maybe it's a good idea to not just have a look at him, but decide, was he Jack the Ripper, was he not? I think for our own mental health, and I think for our own solace, I think it'd be good. And also to do justice to 5 women that were killed.